So good morning, and thank you very much for dialing in this morning to our commercial landlord and tenant update. Um, we're sat here as at the 1st of September. I'm highlighting the date because this area of law currently is changing so rapidly that all I can say is, to the best of our knowledge at this time, this is what the current situation is. That's not to say that we won't get to the point um, by lunchtime, perhaps even, that the government haven't made another announcement which changes things. So we are keeping on top of announcements as fast as we can. I think one of the things that I would say to you is there is a lot of confusion out there at the moment because there are press releases going out about things that may or may not be happening, and then what comes out and when it comes out can be very different. So some people are writing pieces in newspapers or in blogs, and indeed in some in legal updaters about the press releases. Others are writing about what has actually come through in legislation. So I would suggest, if there's anything new that sounds dramatic that you are hearing about, check the primary legislation to make sure it's actually come through in the way expected and that it's in force. So to give you an introduction to me, my name's Claire-Elaine Arthurs. I'm one of the property dispute resolution partners at gunnercooke. So me and my team are very much at the coalface at the moment, dealing with the changes in the law, dealing with the issues where people are having a lot of problems, particularly with recovery of rent and also with other breaches in tenancies, or indeed with tenants who are struggling to meet the requirements of their leases and looking for ways in which they might be able to vary them or indeed end those leases. So as you can imagine, it's keeping us on our toes at the moment. So we've got this morning about half an hour to 40 minutes where I'm going to run through where we currently stand with regards to commercial property tenancies. I will have a look predominantly, as I said, at the non-payment of rent issues, because that is the key issue that many of us are facing at the moment. And then I'll also just take a bit of time to look at some of the other breaches, because obviously life goes on and there are still other problems that we need to be dealing with. What I'm going to ask you to do is, if you have got any questions as we go along, if you can pop them into the chat box, and then we will have some time at the end for us to have a chat through those questions, and I will do my very, very best to answer as many of them as possible for you. Alternatively, if you prefer to have a discussion with me or ask questions offline, then you will have my contact details again at the end that you can note down, so that you can always get in touch with me after the webinar's ended. So what we're going to have a look at today is non-payment of rent. We'll have a look at this new code for commercial letting that's been hot in the press, where we now stand with forfeiture and possession claims, what we are now doing with regards to debt claims. Can you still use statutory demands and winding up petitions? What's happening with the commercial rent arrears recovery? And we'll have a look at some more negotiated solutions. These are things which can be agreed between landlords and tenants, and what the options are for moving those forwards. And then, as I said, we'll have a look at the other breaches, such as breach of other covenants and in particular disrepair. So starting off then with the Voluntary Code of Practice. So this is something that came in June this year, to a great deal of fuss in the press after the government announced that they were bringing in a code of practice. I would like to highlight two things to you. First of all, it's voluntary. Therefore, this has no teeth. There's no way of a tenant enforcing this against a landlord. However, what it does do, very importantly, is give you an insight into what the people creating the legislation in Whitehall are currently thinking. And in particular, I draw your attention to the timeline that it's in force. This code is in force until June 2021, which tells us that they're expecting to have issues until at least the middle of next year, which they will be looking to address. Now, currently, you'll see as we go through, we've got a lot of deadlines coming up at the end of September, but as we know, they are quite frequently being extended at the moment. So I would suggest you bear in mind that June 2021 deadline when you're thinking about how far ahead could they potentially be thinking about extending deadlines, but they will be doing them incrementally for political reasons. So what the Voluntary Code's asking you to look at is transparency and collaboration. Now that's transparency both ways. So it's landlords being honest about the position they're in, but tenants conversely being honest about the position they're in. So it is not unreasonable to be asking a tenant who's asking for time to pay or for a variation to their payment terms to be providing accounts and other evidence to show that they are genuinely struggling. Because unfortunately, we are coming across some tenants out there, as you always will do, who are trying to take advantage of the situation. So there is a level of transparency required there that both parties will act in good faith and will act with the mutual interest of their business continuity. A unified approach so that parties are working together. And then looking again at government support, because the government are giving or have been, at least up until this point, quite a significant amount of support to businesses to try and keep them going. If you have a tenant who is not accessing the support measures, then again, it will not be considered unreasonable for a landlord to say, no, I'm not varying your payment terms. The government are expecting tenants to be accessing as much as possible. And then again, acting reasonably and responsibly. And this means if there are site inspections going on, or if there are reasons that the building needs to be closed, if it's a building that's used by multiple tenants, use of common areas and so on, it's acting in a reasonable and responsible way in respect of COVID. So that's the expectation there. And while this is voluntary, when judges are considering whether a landlord has acted reasonably, they will make reference to the code to see whether they have acted in the spirit in which the code would have expected. So, and then where are we in terms of forfeiture? Now, usually if you have a tenant who isn't paying or isn't able to pay, hasn't done so for some time, and doesn't look like you're going to get recovery from them, you would be looking at forfeiting the lease. Now, obviously, the government is countering this because they don't want lots of businesses being thrown out of their premises whilst they're trying to recover the economy. So where we are at present, with regards to re-entry, assuming you have that provision in the lease, which most modern commercial leases do, we are not able to do that under Section 82 of the Coronavirus Act for rent arrears until after the 30th of September 2020. But if you recall, looking at when they were saying the Voluntary Code is being in place till the middle of next year, and considering the extensions they have done with the possession proceedings, that deadline of the 30th of September, we may well see that moving on at the last moment. So at present, we are gearing up for the beginning of October for a number of peaceful re-entry with a number of enforcement agents assisting us. Whether that's going to happen or not, we don't know at the moment. You do have to recall as well that there will be instances where tenants can claim relief from forfeiture if they have put forward a payment scheme to make up their payments that the court would consider reasonable under the circumstances, and you have decided to go in peaceful re-entry as a landlord, there is a risk that they could ask for relief from forfeiture and have it granted. Now, usually you would expect a relief from forfeiture application to see the court requiring them to make prompt repayment of all of the arrears. What is prompt under the current circumstances is going to vary dramatically. So if they're saying 6 to 12 months to pay it back, you decide to go in anyway and do peaceful re-entry, you are at risk then of a relief from forfeiture. So that's something that really needs to be highlighted more for landlords than perhaps it needed to in the past. In terms of possession proceedings, we've had a lot of jumps on the deadlines on this quite recently. Now, the last deadline was the 23rd of August, and we were expecting the stay on all possession proceedings, including those relating to commercial property, to be lifted as of the 24th. On the 24th, the government passed a new piece of legislation, the amendment number 5 coronavirus rules. They were passed on the 24th using the negative procedure. That means that they come into force without either house actually having approved them. And they extended the stay on proceedings to the 20th of September. This was as a result of political pressure of not having people removed from residential premises over the winter. But the stay affects commercial property as well. So we've been caught with it in respect of commercial landlords. Now, given that that's what the commercial pressure was, the chances of them sticking to the 20th of September deadline and then allowing proceedings to be processed through after that deadline is limited. It's more than likely that they are going to extend this again at least a couple of times, we think, at the moment, from what's coming out in the press, because they do not want either businesses or individuals being removed from properties over the winter, particularly with the threat of a potential second wave still looming over us and local lockdowns. But they had put in place, before the 23rd of August, CPAR 55C, which does tell us what is going to happen after the stay is lifted. So after that stay is lifted, if you've got any proceedings that have been caught in that stay, you are going to need to serve on the court a reactivation notice. So that the court won't automatically be starting all the proceedings up again. They'll be waiting for you to serve a notice, and there's going to be more than likely specialist teams in each court processing the proceedings that have been stayed and looking out for the reactivation notices. So as we come up to the deadline, the question you have to be asking yourself, and that we certainly were towards the end of August, was, do we start proceedings that are going to sit in the pile of stays and then wait for the reactivation notices to be processed? Or do we wait and issue proceedings after the stay finishes, because they will be processed as a standard claim and may well actually find their way to a hearing more quickly? Now, this has been done on purpose because obviously the court doesn't want people putting in place their possession proceedings if they can help it at this time. So they're trying to do everything possible to dissuade us from doing that. Why are landlords still doing it? Well, because they've got their own pressures coming down on them from their lenders and from their other requirements on their resources. If they're not getting rent, they need to be seen to be doing something. And at the moment, what most of them, all they can do is actually put in a possession procedure claim and hope that it's going to be processed as soon as possible. Now, the other two things to bear in mind when we are looking at that CPR 55C is that along with the reactivation notice and along with any new possession claims we need to issue, we need to put in a notice of the COVID-19 impact on the tenant. So we will have to put in details of the discussion we've had with them. And for this reason as well, landlords should be asking their tenants how they're getting on, asking for copies of their accounts, so that if they do find themselves in a position where they are going to have to try to get possession back through the courts, they're going to be able to provide that information to show that they have had that reasonable discussion with the tenant. And again, this comes back to the ideas we see under the code, which, as I said, they're voluntary, but they're going to start being looked at by the court in more detail. The other couple of things to note were that usually you would expect to only have 7 days notice of a possession hearing. The possession hearings will be given 21 days notice. And also you would normally expect it to be listed within 8 weeks. That has been suspended, that requirement. So the 21-day notice and the suspension of the 8-week period for listing has currently been suspended up until March next year, but again is subject to further extension. And really that's a case of when the government lets the court start processing, how bad is the backlog and how quickly can they get through it. If they've not managed to get through it, then they will simply extend that deadline. So I think we are going to be looking probably into late 2021 before the procedure gets back to normal. So this is going to be quite extended if we do need to get any tenants out for non-payment of rent. It's not good news for landlords. There isn't much support being put out for landlords, but currently the political pressure is coming to keep the businesses going and to keep people in their properties, and that's what the government is focusing on. One of the things that we can still do, though, is debt recovery claims. Debt claims are still being processed as usual. There are some delays with the courts in terms of listings, because of the fact that a lot of the court buildings are still not open. But with us being able to do video hearings and telephone hearings and judges running those now from the comfort of their own homes, that is starting to move along really quite quickly, and the processing is certainly speeded up. So you're now looking at between 4 to 6 weeks in some cases for the issue of a claim. Previously it was less than that, but once it has been issued, they do seem to be getting processed through reasonably quickly in the majority of cases. In terms of enforcement, we're now able to enforce again. We did have an issue whereby the bailiffs were unable to get into properties. So the enforcement was essentially them just writing letters or phoning the debtors, which wasn't very effective. But as of the end of August, they have been able to get into properties and are back out and about. So we've got High Court enforcement agents or the court bailiffs. Court bailiffs are very backed up, as you might expect. High Court enforcement agents are clearing things very quickly. So it is worth paying the £60 to move it up if you have got any debts that you need enforcing, to a High Court enforcement officer to enforce it for you. One of the things that you do need to bear in mind, though, is that if a unit has been closed because of local lockdown, the bailiffs will not be able to force entry to it. Similarly, if they've not reopened again because the business is in trouble, they need to go back to the court to get permission to use reasonable force to enter the property. The courts are very reluctant to give that, particularly at present. So it's really only able to do enforcement of that nature if you are able to actually get into the property easily. The courts are currently not listing pulling in directors for them to disclose the financial position and assets of the companies, or of them as individuals, if your commercial tenant's an individual. But they are expecting to start doing that again towards the end of September, October, according to what we're being told by the clerks at the court. They are, though, giving out freezing orders and third-party debt orders with regards to companies and individuals' bank accounts. So it is possible to secure things in that way. So in terms of the debt recovery, we're finding this is particularly effective when it's being used against tenants who are actively trading and are not in specific difficulty. So we have had some larger tenants in particular who've done very well over lockdown, but have decided to help their balance sheet that they're not going to be paying their rent and are taking advantage of the situation. But because they're up and running and a county court judgment would cause issues for them, having a debt claim issued against them is actually quite an effective way of bringing that round. The other thing that it can do is where you have got a tenant who is sat there with rent arrears accruing, and you're in an area where it would be easy to re-let your property, you may want to get it back. Now, obviously, we've got issues forfeiting at the moment, but if you put pressure on a tenant by issuing a debt claim, it may be that you're able to settle and get them to surrender as part of that settlement of the debt claim. So that's really our most effective tool that we've got available and working properly for us at this time. Insolvency has been a very active area, as you might imagine. The Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act came out in June. One of the big things that you will have heard about is the moratorium, which can be extended for weeks in terms of insolvency action, and also the new restructuring plans. I'm not going to spend any time on those because, to be honest, they are more the remit of my colleagues in insolvency partners at gunnercooke, who I'm sure will be happy to talk you through them in detail. But the key things for commercial landlords are that the statutory demands, if they're in respect of rent arrears, are not going to be valid if sent before the 20th of September 2020. And winding up petitions are not going to be valid until after the 20th of September either, unless you can categorically show that the COVID-19 pandemic has not contributed to the issue that has led to that winding up. So essentially what that means is if we've got non-payment of rent, previously it would have been quite effective to send a statutory demand to a tenant requiring payment. It's not something that we can use at present. There is a hope there that you might be able to do it after the 20th of September, but again, my feeling on this, seeing what's happened recently, is that those deadlines may also be extended. So that's what we're working to at present, but we may find that at the end of September that's extended too. Commercial rent arrears recovery, CRAR. CRAR is not something that gets used particularly often, but it is available. The reason that it's not very effective is because it works by sending a notice to the tenant saying we're going to come in, look at what goods you've got and enforce against them if you've not paid your rent. It only works for pure rent, so it won't work for service charges or insurance or any other sums that may be due under the lease. And the problem that you have is when the enforcement officers usually send that notice, a canny tenant quite often clears that particular premises. So it's not as effective as it could be, but where you have got something like a large warehouse that will not be easy to clear quickly, it can have some impact. It only works though on commercial premises. So if you've got clients where they've got all their staff working from home and they've taken goods or they've taken IT equipment or machinery or anything to another location, you're not going to be able to use CRAR to enforce against them there. And if the unit is still locked down from a local lockdown or is closed, then again, as I said earlier, the enforcement agents are going to have difficulty getting a right to access it. So CRAR is very effective in certain circumstances, but you really have to have a perfect set of circumstances before it's something that's going to be worth considering. So negotiated solutions. Well, one of the good bits of news for landlords is Section 82(2) of the Coronavirus Act, which says during the relevant period, which currently is up until the end of September, no conduct on behalf of a landlord, unless it's expressly given in writing, is going to be regarded as waiving a right of re-entry or forfeiture under the business tenancy for non-payment of rent. So if you have been discussing backwards and forwards between a landlord and a tenant about varying the rent, it won't be considered as being a waiver. Similarly, if rent demands have still been getting sent out, that won't waive it either. Or if rent in parts has been accepted, that again is not going to be considered a waiver. So that does give us some hope that at the end of all these stays, we might actually be able to move things on. So that brings us on then neatly to rent variation agreements. If you have agreed a variation in payment terms, the best thing that you can do is to record that in a rent variation agreement. It doesn't have to be a terribly long formal document. It can be in the form of a side letter that both parties have signed, but make sure that it's very clear what has been varied, what the terms are, and for what period. And that's for the protection of both the landlord and the tenant, because otherwise there is the potential there that there may be variations made to the agreement between them that have permanent in nature with unintended consequences. We are helping a lot of people do those at the moment. They're relatively quick and easy to put in place, but if you get them wrong, they could compound the issues that you're already facing. In terms of deposits, there is possible to draw down on deposits. Most rent deposit deeds will allow you to do this. Just be aware of notice periods in them. And there is nothing at present stopping landlords from pursuing guarantors either Although what we are finding is where a company or an individual is having a problem, then quite often they are linked to their guarantor, and it may be that they're having financial difficulties too. But we are going after guarantors, particularly having some success going after guarantors where the parent company is non-domicile, so UK company with a US parent company, for example, where they're doing better than we are here. As I said earlier, I mentioned we can agree surrender. If you are going to agree a surrender, make sure you document it for the clarity of both parties. It gives the landlord a peace of mind to be able to relet the property, gives the tenant peace of mind that that's drawn a line under everything. Abandonment is happening, where we're simply finding that, particularly in smaller units, the individual who's rented them has just simply disappeared, cleared out the unit and disappeared. You can go back in and surrender that. I would highly recommend putting an abandonment notice up on the door, and you will need to deal with any items if there are a few items left in there as an involuntary bailee. If you find yourself in that situation, it's best to seek legal advice to make sure that you've got the property clear before you start reletting it again, because it may be in some cases that the tenant's simply having difficulties due to COVID, and you could come back and have a relief from forfeiture claim against you if you don't do it correctly. And then more creatively, to give some support to rent variation agreements, the other thing we're seeing is charges over goods. And also enforcement agents have been piloting using walking possession agreements, which is a fairly new form of agreement where they go in, they take a list of goods as they would if they were affecting CRA, and then that is put into an agreement, and provided the tenant sticks with the repayment plan, everything is fine. If they don't, the enforcement agent goes back in, takes those goods and sells them as against the arrears. So if you're looking for security, that does help. The reason they're becoming more popular is particularly where the landlords have got their own issues with regards to lenders saying you need to be taking action. If they've got the variation agreement and they've got some form of security, lenders are then offering them variations on their own repayment of loans based upon those agreements, and they can see the securities there in order to make sure the payments come back up. So you're more likely to get that. Other breaches, you still need to put your section 146 notice in prior to peaceful re-entry. The thing about section 146 is you've got to give a tenant reasonable opportunity to rectify the breaches. Currently, with COVID going on, what is reasonable is going to clearly be extended significantly. And also you've got to bear in mind that if you haven't given them what is considered to be a reasonable period, you could have a relief from forfeiture claim against you. So again, that comes down to having that open dialogue with the tenant and having as much information as possible. Claims for possession, if you have to put in a claim and get a possession order in order to get back in, they are caught by the general stay on possession claims, unfortunately. But that's not to say that you can't do anything with regards to what's happening at the property. Most commercial leases will have what's called a Jervis and Harris clause. What this means is that if there's disrepair at the property, the landlord can give notice, say you need to get the disrepair done within a couple of months. If it isn't done, they can go in, do the works, and then recharge it as a debt claim. As I said, debt claims are going through at present, but they are taking a little longer. But the key thing here is that if you are anticipating that as soon as we're able to do peaceable re-entry again, you're going to take the property back and you want to relet it, some canny landlords are going in, doing it up, ready for it to be relet in advance of the deadline coming. So it can, even though they may not get that money back and they may not get it back from dilapidations, in any case, because the tenant's in financial difficulty, at least it means the unit's going to be in good condition and can go back on the market straight away. The other thing to bear in mind as well is the minimum energy efficiency standards. From 2018 onwards, we've had to make sure that any units we're letting are a category E or above. For new tenancies, for those existing tenancies, sorry, it didn't become an issue until 2023. But there are going to be many landlords who are seeing units coming through that they may have expected to be tenanted until after 2023 that are now coming back on the market. And of course, if they're substandard, they're going to have to be looking at doing the works. Now, it's more than likely that the majority of landlords looked at this in 2018, made up a plan for what works they were doing to bring their stock up to the right level, and have been working to that plan. It may just be worth, if you've got that plan, or if you're helping somebody who has got a portfolio, to make sure that they've revised that in line with what is now currently happening, because it is catching people out, and the local authorities will be only too happy to start asking for the fines to be paid, because they're obviously short on cash at the moment as well. So coming to the end then, pressure on landlords, things that we need to be aware of, break options. Many tenants were perhaps not looking like they were going to exercise their break options, but a lot are now, including tenants that are doing well. The reason that the tenants that are doing well are exercising break options is because some of them are downsizing their office space with more staff being able to work from home, or have changed how they're working over COVID and the space no longer suits them. The other thing is, it's a tenants market out there at the moment. So there are a lot of landlords offering units with rent-free periods or more attractive rent than the lease currently affords them. So they are exercising their break options and they are moving. If you've got a tenant with a break option in their lease coming up, or a rolling break option in their lease, you should be having a dialogue with them, and it may be that variations are agreed to keep that tenant in situ. But just being aware of that so it doesn't come as a surprise. As I said, we are getting some lenders who are giving lending holidays and variations to loans. Some of them are finding, particularly the smaller investment banks, that they are struggling to do that now. They are looking for assertive action, so they are looking for a possession claim being in. They are looking for charges over goods, some way of seeing that they're going to get their money back as soon as possible, in order for them to be able to get things past their credit committee, to give landlords, particularly the bigger portfolios, some leeway. LPA receivers can still be appointed. Properties are still going into auction and they are selling fast. There are a lot of people taking advantage of the fact that they are able to get good quality units cheaper through LPA receivers at the moment. And we are seeing enforcement of charges with people just with lenders taking a straightforward route to getting an order for sale. So unfortunately, that is becoming more active, and it means, again, lenders really do need to make sure that they have been having a dialogue with the landlords and the lenders, as well as having one between landlords and tenants. So I appreciate that's been a very whistle-stop tour and what we've got this morning.